Hello to our next assignment. Now that we have practiced how to use the squirrel hair brush in our practice Vasli, we will now come to the business end of the semester. This is where we now will dive deep into making a copy of one of the masterworks that we have in the exhibition. Every student will select one example from this exhibition and compose it as a single study. For that, however, we have broken down this entire assignment into several smaller steps. And in today's demo video, we will just be doing the initial steps on how to transfer our drawing from either a sketchbook or a prep paper, how to transfer that onto the final Vasli paper, and then how to make our first inked drawing of that. So for that, we will need a tracing paper, and we will need our Vasli. I've brought one of my practice Vaslis just so that it's easier and quick to demonstrate, but the students will be using their final Vasli paper that they made and prepared and sized and burnished. So that's the one that we will be using for the final assignment. So let's start with the demonstration. I usually have a sketchbook which is actually made of the same handmade paper from which we make our Vaslis, and that's where I sometimes finalize my drawings and do my practice as well. And so I'm just taking one drawing from this, from my sketches, and we'll just start by tracing that onto our Vasli paper. And while we are doing these drawings, and that's more for the students who are following along with this assignment, if we select one of these paintings that we have in this collection, it'll be nice that if you can print it out and maybe even scale it slightly bigger, because some of them are really small, and just start practicing those drawings even with the normal vine charcoal, and just start making the main composition. Very, very quickly you can just sort of see how the entire composition will be, and charcoal is actually a really good medium to make a basic composition. And then you can go in and then start inking it with one of the squirrel hair brushes. And that's what I've done here in this drawing. It's more like a prep drawing in which I started off the drawing with the vine charcoal and then inked it with one of my squirrel hair brushes. And after that process is done, we go in and trace the final sketch. So traditionally, tracing was an extremely important and integral part of the whole drawing process and even building up to the final painting, because historically, master artists would have sketches, drawings, preparatory studies at hand according to whichever theme that was required for them to make. A patron would say that, all right, you need to make a hunting scene. So the master artist and the families of those artists would have in their arsenal an entire catalog of sketches and drawings, sometimes from their own forefathers, that they would say, all right, I want the tiger to be like this, I want the hunter to be like this, he'll be wearing this sort of clothing, this is the sort of background that we'll have. And so everything will already be ready in their preparatory studies. And then they would use extremely thin vellum as a tracing paper, sometimes even using deer hide, thinned down, extremely light, almost becoming like the see-through modern day tracing paper. And then they would draw over it, and after the drawing was done, they would perforate the sheet with a tiny needle. So I'll just do the tracing, but because our tracing sheets are more pliable and more supple, you don't really need to perforate the drawings anymore. So I usually don't do that. It's more like a traditional practice that you would first make a cartoon, similar to early sort of Western practices also. When they were doing fresco painting, they would make tracings and cartoons, and then perforate those the tracing paper or those sheets in tiny, tiny holes, and then they would have like a cheesecloth or like a cloth with lots of hole in it, and have crushed carbon inside the cloth, tie it up, and then just pass the carbon cloth along the holes of the sheet, and that way the image would get transferred onto the final surface on which you would be doing the painting. But we actually can have shortcuts and cut to the final tracing because of the paper that we use today. We don't really need to do those holes and go over the entire process, and I'll walk you through the entire process of how to make that transfer. All right, so I've taped the tracing paper onto my drawing, the preparatory drawing, and then I'll just use a pencil. A nice sharp pencil is good to keep it precise. And the drawing that I'm using is a study that I made of Lord Krishna, one of the most popular figures to be used in Indian painting. So it will be good if students, after they've selected their final painting from our collection, make multiple sketches and drawings so that they familiarize themselves with the language of that particular artwork. And once they've finalized their composition, and in their composition it will be nice to also have some sort of background. Then once that composition is completely finalized in a sketchbook or in some preparatory paper, then they can do this process, exactly what I'm doing here. All right, so we have our basic sketch now, the basic tracing. So now what we do is, rather than doing the perforation, which would take much more time, and then crushing our charcoal into a piece of cheesecloth and then passing through it, it's a really good technique, and you get these tiny, tiny holes, sort of tiny, tiny dotted line which you can ink. I ended up doing something more like using like a carbon paper, but making my own carbon paper. What I use is, in this case, a light dry pigment. This is a local local stone that is found really easily in northern South Asia, but you can actually use any dry pastel colors and take any cheap dry pastel and maybe with a sort of burnt umber or burnt sienna type, and then just crush it well in a mortar pestle, and then when you have that, all you will need to do is put some on the back side of the tracing paper and just spread it where you have your drawing, but on the other side, of course. And so this makes it a really light carbon paper, because if you use normal carbon paper, it's very black, and we don't need to make dark lines in our first tracing transference. When we transfer our first tracing, we don't want it to be too dark. We just want a light transfer. That way you have more space to make corrections. If you think that some part of the drawing is not right, you can still keep on making corrections to it. So I put all the extra excess away, because otherwise the paper will get all muddy. And then we can start with our transfer. And the transfer I'm doing is before doing the white priming layer. It's like the first thing that we are doing on this Vasli paper is the transfer. So we place it exactly where we would like it to be. With my students, of course, with our class and anyone who's following along, we will fit our final composition, whatever it is, within a window, maybe following the original windows that we have in our paintings. If we've made a selection, for example, of this self-portrait, the Mughal self-portrait of Keshav Das, you can see how it has a window in which you have the figure, and behind it there's a subtle background. So that's the type of composition that we are going for. And then we start making it again, but this time it will transfer into the Vasli paper. You can see in this time I'm pressing it a little hard and making a more sort of rough line, because I really want it to transfer. If it's too light, it might not transfer. Yeah, so the drawing is transferring now, but it's a really light transfer. It's almost just like it's for my reference. All right, so after we've done that transfer, we can see this really light drawing on our final paper, which now we will ink really gently, trying not to make it too dark. And for this first inking, actually I do not use the carbon black watercolor. What I use is very light wash of the red, which is carmine nakarat, cochineal. In South Asia, we have a similar sort of cousin to the cochineal, same bugs that are crushed to make red, which is called lak. So that's what I use, and that's what traditionally you see a lot of the underdrawing is sometimes done with that. And so because this is just powder, and even if you breathe on it or something, it can easily just blow away, we need to quickly do this outline. And this will be our first outline. If you have any watercolors, any normal watercolors, Winsor and Newton or anything, you can just use one of the red cakes and just mix it a little bit on your hand here. And you can try on your sort of rough paper the sort of line that you have. We want a pretty light line. So I'm just making it more light by adding water to it. And I can keep my original drawing here just for reference. And this doesn't have to be 100% precise, because after this we will do our first prime layer, so this will get quite subdued. So this is more just like transferring the drawing, and then we can work from it with it. There's still room for improvement, for corrections. All right, so we have our first drawing that we have now transferred, and we can even get rid of any of the pigment that we don't need. So this is our first drawing that we've done on our final Vasli paper. Then the next step will be to prime the Vasli itself, and that I showed you how to do that before as well, but I can show it to you again so that you have an idea of what happens to the first under drawing. So now we do our final step for today's demonstration. We have our safeda, the white, which I've diluted quite a lot into a thin-ish paste. I could dilute it even more. We don't want it to be too opaque. And then we'll just do one layer for the drawing. And for the students who are doing it, they will have composed it in a window. So we'll actually keep the safeda layer in the window itself. So I'm sort of have an imaginary window here. And again, remember to really flood the surface. We don't want the brush to touch the surface, otherwise you'll have these horrible lines. It needs to be as smooth as possible. And also, if your brush is scraping the surface hard, it will lift the underdrawing, the red underdrawing, because that's just like pure pigment. It will get lifted, it will get merged with the white pigment. We don't want any of that. We want it to be really smooth and clean. All right. Then we just let it dry, and we really let it dry completely. And once it's completely dried, we will then burnish it on that smooth either glass or marble surface using one of the Cowrie seashell burnishes that we have. And we will start our next step of this assignment from that point. We'll give it a little good burnish once it's dried, and then we will go in with a much more fine squirrel hair brush and then start doing our first formal outline of our drawing. And then from there we will go into the next steps. So until then, goodbye.